Thank you, Alistair. As you mentioned, this is our first trip to Australia, my wife Pam's and mine, and to Melbourne. As it happens, it was in 1985. She and I attended a dinner at the Union Club in Boston, which was held in honor of the Melbourne delegation to Boston, which was establishing a sister city relationship with Boston. The mayor of Boston at that time was Raymond Flynn, Ray Flynn, who later became the United States representative to the Vatican. And I believe the Lord Mayor of Melbourne was a man named Thomas Lynch at that time. And this is a relationship which I believe sponsors a scholarship. So it's a continuing connection, which I'm delighted to be reminded of. Melissa Conley Tyler she was never actually a student of mine, but we became quite well acquainted when she was a student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And I'm looking forward to seeing her when she arrives. I saw her recently in Boston. She's one of our most distinguished graduates, as you can imagine. The particular reason for my coming to Australia this time was to attend and participate in the annual meeting of diplomatic academies, the formal name of which is the International Forum on Diplomatic Training, which was held in Canberra at Australian National University. And I was invited to give a public lecture beforehand, a formal lecture, at the beginning of the conference to initiate it. And I addressed the theme of the meeting of diplomatic academies, which was the diplomacy of power transitions. The diplomacy of power transitions. Very interesting subject conceptually and also historically. And I am, as Alistair mentioned, a diplomatic historian. I thought, well, the United States was a rising power at one time, just as it is said China is a rising power today. How did it handle the diplomacy of that particular phenomenon? And the text I have prepared for purposes of delivering this formal lecture in Canberra would be too long for me to read. But what I would like to do, with your permission, is to use it as a base for my remarks. And I've selected some of the PowerPoint slides that I used, which actually I think will save some words to allow plenty of time for interchange with you in discussion as we proceed. The title that I've chosen, which was the title also of my talk in Canberra, is The United States as a Rising Power in the Asia-Pacific Region. And amid the current discussion of rising powers in the Pacific, I'm mindful, as I noted, that the US was a rising power in the region itself at one time. Is it still rising? One is tempted to ask. Or has it become an established power, even a status quo, a static power? Or is it now a declining power relative to the movement of other powers? If not in a physical, absolute sense, then in comparative terms. And I'd like to pose that question not only to myself, but to you as well. And I would, perhaps in our discussion afterward, we could have the benefit of some of your thoughts about how the U.S. is perceived and how it actually is in its relationship to other countries and to the problems and opportunities of this region. The stakes arguably are very high in asking, is the United States declining relative to others, or rising, or just simply static in a kind of holding position? For there is attendant to this question, and also in the discussion of rising powers in the power transition context, the question of whether, if one power, in this case, to be explicit about it, the People's Republic of China, is rising rapidly, what effect does that have on the tranquility, the peace, the context within which it is rising? Is the rise of one power relative to others inherently and inevitably conflictual, even likely to result in war? In other words, is there something about power discrepancies in and of itself, or in themselves, that tend to produce conflict, as causes of war. Some of you may be familiar with the current discussion of the Thucydides trap. Graham Allison, a classmate of mine when I was a student at Harvard, at the Kennedy School of Government, and some of his colleagues have been engaged in a historical study. And what they have done is to look at previous conflicts around the world, in Asia as well as in Europe, to examine what the impact, what the outcome was of situations in which there was a rising power and what they term a ruling power. And their starting point, I'm not sure it was actually historically their starting point, but by reference it is, Thucydides stated in this following sentence, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable." But the rise and the fear that inspired made war inevitable. What the Allison group found in their Belfer studies was that war between the United States and China in the decades ahead is not just possible, but much more likely than is recognized at the moment. Indeed, judging by the historical record, war is more likely than not. In the realm of popular literature, too, there's a good deal of discussion currently about the possibility, even the plausibility of a conflict between the United States and the People's Republic. One book on the subject, I happened to hear the author speak about it not long ago, is called Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War, published in 2015. Some of you may know of it or have read it. Peter Singer is a technologist, and his colleague August Cole is a novelist. And they project, on the basis of technological developments and other developments, a showdown between the US and China in the Pacific. Again, arguing that it is not just possible, it's plausible. In the phrase of the Belfer Center group, more likely than not, if one looks at the historical record. Somewhat more optimistically, Allison and his colleagues write, quote, "When the parties avoided war, it required huge, painful adjustment in attitudes and action on the part not just of the challenger, but also the challenged. What might this mean for the United States and for the People's Republic of China today and in the future, and for other countries in the Asia-Pacific region?" My hypothesis, which I developed in a bit more depth, or certainly length and detail in Canberra, is that adjustment, though it might be painful and will require concessions, mutual concessions, I would emphasize, can be brought about peacefully if and when there is a shared concept of order. That is, a general acceptance of the principles and even specific rules on the basis of which relations, including trade and military relations, are conducted. This premise, common agreement on basic principles, is a very large part of what made possible the great rapprochement between the United States and Britain at the end of the 19th century. And also the transition, the passing of the torch, so to speak, between Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and the United States at the end of World War II. This clearly was a power transition. It happened twice over a period of time. And it was done so without a power clash, with obviously concessions being made, particularly on the British side, but arguably on the US side as well. So as a historian attuned to the possibilities of action and the contingencies of events, things that happen, I'm less deterministic about the likelihood or possibility of a clash than others might be. As a historian, for which I make no apologies whatsoever, because after all, Henry Kissinger is said to have said, "History is the only policy science." And I find that a lot of those involved in diplomacy agree that that's the case. I think he came to that conclusion on the basis of his experience as a diplomat as well as a scholar. He makes an interesting observation about the balance of power, which I think is suggestive for the Asia-Pacific region. In most of his scholarly writing, until recently, he wrote a very interesting and very detailed book on China, as probably many of you know. But most of his work was about the concert of Europe from the Metternich Castlereagh period to the present. In Europe, as he emphasized, the balance of power was itself part of an international order. It was, that is to say, an idea, a norm, a set of rules, not just a circumstance. The European regional balance, Kissler explains, quote, developed not only in practice, as is inevitable in the absence of hegemony, but as a system of legitimacy that facilitated decisions and moderated policies. It was like a dance, so to speak, the rules of which were well known to all the participants, all the players in the European system. And he comments for purposes of contrast, quote, such a congruence does not exist in Asia, as is shown by the priorities the major countries have assigned to themselves. In this respect, there has been in the Asia-Pacific region what might even be termed a geodiplomatic vacuum. Has it been a priority of the United States historically to fill this vacuum diplomatically? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and today, perhaps. It's not clear. A rising power, such as the United States of America clearly was in the late 1890s, needed, in order to be considered more than an upstart and a danger to others, as I've suggested, to project the concept of order along with its power, in a sense to justify its power. This order concept had to be consistent with its own institutions and history, which in any case it naturally reflects. Such consistency makes its behavior authentic to others and also, very importantly, predictable to them. In order to be acceptable to others and eventually even to be considered legitimate internationally, the order concept needs to be not just self-expressive, but also inclusive and adaptive as well. It needs to be sufficiently broad and flexible to be responsive to and able even to accommodate the interests, views, rights, and sometimes demands of others. This, I might add in passing, parenthetically, is a challenge to the People's Republic of China. That is, whether its projection of a concept of order, concentric circles, the 9-dash line, and the like, is one which is inclusive, broad, flexible, adaptive, and capable of taking account of the interests, rights, views, and even the demands of others. Some of you may have seen a very interesting article on this point in the latest Economist about Chinese diplomacy, calling it a ham-fisted approach to relations within the region. So in that sense, there's a kind of a counterpoint between the U.S. experience, at least during some of its history, and the Chinese today. What I did in the lecture in Canberra, and I'll briefly go through this now, was to discuss the diplomacy of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region according to three different stages in sequence. The first stage I call the open door policy era, from 1899 to 1941. The second stage was the period of what I term American supremacy in the Asia-Pacific, lasting from 1945 to about 1972 with the trip of President Nixon to China and his and Henry Kissinger's exercise of triangular diplomacy. The third period, that of the present, is a period of projected and in many cases actually realized partnerships of the United States with countries of the larger Asia-Pacific region, including those of Southeast Asia and also the Indian Ocean region. The present period, the partnerships era, I call it, is inherently more multilateral not in a formal United Nations sense, but multilateral in being multi-party, as well as informal. It is network-like, and it to some degree replaces the hub and spoke pattern of previous security-oriented treaties and other agreements of the 1950s and 1960s. Each of these historical periods, the open door policy era, the American supremacy era, and the partnerships era, has a distinct diplomacy. Yet there is also a high degree of continuity from one to the other. So first of all, the open door policy era. Historical, but I think there are a lot of connections between this earlier period and the present. There were three major wars that, in a sense, initiated these phases of American diplomacy: the Spanish-American War, the Second World War, and the Vietnam War. America's Pacific Ocean rise, its Pacific rise that everyone knows, was not peaceful. The United States fought a war against Spain, bringing to an end that country's history as a great power, a power transition, not only in the Pacific, but in Europe as well. This was a power transition that had little to do with diplomacy. As you can see here, Theodore Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who instructed Admiral Dewey to move from Hong Kong and be prepared for war against Spain, which was really focused on Cuba, not on the Philippines. But the U.S. acquisition of control of the Philippines was almost a byproduct of what was happening 90 miles offshore, the southern part of the United States. Kind of accident, so to speak. This resulted in the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, a good deal of struggle against the Aguinaldo insurrection there. But it produced a major foreign policy initiative. This was the set of circular notes produced by W.W. Rockhill, the smaller photograph, who was an American diplomat with a lot of experience in Asia, who drafted for Secretary of State John Hay, who had been ambassador to the court of St. James's, the open door notes of 1899 and 1900. The first of these notes asked the countries to whom this was presented, the British, the Germans, the French, the Japanese, the Russians also, to subscribe to the principle of essentially non-discrimination. Fair field and no favor. There should be no favor in terms of tariffs or harbor dues or railroad charges within the spheres of influence of any of these countries. The Germans were in the Shandong Peninsula, for example. And the second notes of 1900 asked the countries that received this circular to subscribe to the principle of China's territorial and administrative integrity. Now, the position of the United States, though it had defeated Spain, was not a strong one. It seemed as though the U.S. Navy was predominant in Indonesia. It wasn't. This was a huge leap, a huge stretch. You probably know the term of Paul Kennedy in his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, uses the term imperial overstretch. This was certainly an example of that. The Philippines were strategically a liability rather than an asset at that point, even though coaling stations and so on were somewhat advantageous for the U.S. in promoting access to China. The open door notes were prosecuted diplomatically, but following the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt, when he became president, accidentally owing the assassination of President McKinley, who arguably was the first American president to have a sense of the relationship of the United States to a world balance of power. He saw interconnections between the U.S. and in North America, the Caribbean, the balance of power in the Mediterranean, for example. He dealt with the Moroccan crisis, also in the Far East, as it was then called. he was asked quietly by the Japanese to mediate the conflict between Russia and Japan, the Russo-Japanese War, which in terms of present-day negotiation theorists had become a mutually hurting stalemate. Japan had the upper hand, in part because of its proximity, in part because of its relatively advanced technology, but it was very costly in almost every respect. However, it was impossible to achieve a negotiated settlement, bilaterally or otherwise, while the Baltic fleet of the Russians was coming around the world, past Vietnam. It was an attempt on the part of the Russians to restore the balance in the Far East. But Admiral Togo, in the Battle of Tufts Straits, almost completely destroyed the Russian fleet. The Russians, having lost the balance of power in Asia, decided to negotiate. And the result was the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was negotiated at the naval station in Kittery, Maine, not far from where Pam and I go in the summertime. They're very proud of that particular history. Roosevelt did not actually mediate, though he did propose at one point a solution which made possible an agreement, which was to split Sakhalin Island in half, with the Japanese controlling only the south. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize at the time. So we see the United States emerging as a kind of arbiter. The balance of power is a very ambiguous term. It can mean simply an equilibrium, it can mean preponderance of power, or it can mean, as in the case of Britain, the country that is the equilibrator. This is the make weight. In this case, the U.S. wasn't even a make weight, but it was neutral and impartial, in part because of the salience of its role after the Spanish-American War. It was known, and therefore, somewhat like the Pope, from the outside, could step in and help to provide auspices that made that agreement possible. What Roosevelt did, I mentioned he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was a navalist. He'd written a very influential book on the War of the naval aspects of the War of 1812, which influenced Alfred Thayer Mahan. He sent the American Atlantic Fleet on renamed the Great White Fleet because his ships were painted white on an around-the-world trip into the Pacific. I subsequently learned, particularly from David Lee, a historian in the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in Canberra, that your Prime Minister, Deakin, invited the fleet to Australia because Australia was concerned about Japan's military success against China, against Russia. Australia was also concerned about the alliance that Britain had with Japan, which allowed Britain to concentrate its military focus on Germany and to some degree to look the other way, maybe exposing British interests in the Pacific area. So Prime Minister Deakin invited the fleet to arrive in Australia, which it did do Sydney first. Melbourne was competitive. It was a huge parade. I've seen photographs of this. Some of the sailors stayed for reasons which I need not elaborate on. Some of you may be descendants of these sailors. Well, the Great White Fleet did have an effect and signified American interest in the Pacific area. The next major stage, following the First World War, complicated subject which I'm going to gloss over, the Versailles Treaty and all that, was the Washington Conference of 1920-21, 1922. Though usually called in the textbooks the Washington Naval Conference, it actually dealt more with the Far East, the naval balance in the Far East. All of the major treaties that resulted from it had a bearing on the situation in the Pacific, both the balance of power and on the international legal order. There were three major treaties that came out of the Washington Conference. The first was the Four-Power Treaty, by which the high contracting parties, the United States, the British Empire, which included Australia at that time as a negotiating party, France, with its interests in the Pacific, and Japan, negotiated an agreement by which they would submit a controversy arising out of any Pacific question, very general, involving their rights, not settled by diplomacy. They would meet in joint conference. There was no mechanism to implement this, but it was a kind of consultative pact. It also replaced the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And in retrospect, a lot of people in various countries have had reservations about that, because it meant that Japan was disconnected in some ways from British diplomatic and other influence. The Five-Power Treaty, which is better known, had more of an impact on the balance of power. It established a naval ratio with Britain and the United States having 5, Japan 3, probably it should have been 2.5, because there was a non-fortification agreement that went along with it that limited the fortifications. There couldn't be any further fortifications in any of those islands, those territories, surrounded by dotted lines in the Pacific. So what that meant was local superiority for Japanese naval strength in the waters closest to it. There wasn't much the US or the other powers could do to beef themselves up navally in order to be a counterpoise to the Japanese, as long as that treaty lasted, into the 1930s. The Nine-Power Treaty was a continuation of the open door policy. In a sense, it internationalized the open door notes. That all of the countries that had interests in China, including Portugal, Italy, Belgium, agreed to respect the territorial and administrative integrity of China. This was the Washington system, as it has come to be called. Secretary of State Hughes saw a lot of potential in it. This is a short statement, but I think it's meaningful. In a speech before the American Historical Association later in 1922, he said, "The Washington Conference, if its work continues to enjoy the same support in public sentiment, which was so emphatically expressed at the time, will not only afford a better assurance of peace and the continuance of friendly relations, but will serve to illustrate the method of effective international cooperation, which fully accords with the genius of American institutions." Reading between the lines, I think his emphasis, I assume he emphasized the word effective, but that emphasis contrasted what the Republicans did in the 1920s under his diplomatic leadership and what Woodrow Wilson did in Paris. The League of Nations was a universal commitment, whereas the Washington system was regionally focused. And in that sense, it was more realistic, better fitted to the actual situation. One of the key figures, and this was largely new to me in researching the paper that I delivered in Canberra. And I won't go into detail, but he's a fascinating person, John Van Antwerp McMurray, who had both China and Japanese diplomatic experience. He knew both countries pretty well, unlike most of the China or Japan hands in the Department of State. He greatly admired Hughes and had the view that if the Washington system, these treaties were implemented correctly and fully, that could have been a flexible, resilient system to maintain peace in the Asia-Pacific area almost indefinitely. But what happened in the late 1920s was, according to his account, which he later wrote in a famous memorandum in the mid-1930s, was that the signatories to these treaties started acting independently without consulting with each other. And rather challengingly, he wrote that Japan, and he did this knowledgeably, actually respected the terms of the Washington treaties better than did the United States, Britain, or China itself, because China wanted to be released from the obligation to control its tariffs. China wanted to increase its tariff levels to derive more revenue. So the relationships among these countries fell apart. And what McMurray concluded in his memorandum that he wrote in the 1930s was that the Washington system, quote, was allowed during 1925 to 1929 to fall into desuetude, and the formulation of principles upon which it was to have been based have inevitably lost authority. The Washington treaties have therefore ceased in practical fact to be available as a means of accommodating such strains as may arise from the changes in equilibrium that lately have taken place in the Far East. Of course, he was here referring to the Japanese move into Manchuria, in defiance of the Covenant of the League of Nations, in defiance of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, concluded by Aristide Briand and Frank Kellogg, Secretary of State. That's Myron Herrick, the American ambassador to France, in between. And also in defiance of the Stimson non-recognition doctrine. Henry Stimson, who was President Hoover's Secretary of State, declared that the United States would not recognize, I'll quote his exact words, the United States, the U.S. government, quote, deems it its duty to notify both that it cannot admit the legality of any situation de facto, nor does it intend to recognize any treaty or agreement entered into which may impair American treaty rights, including those relating to China or international policy relative to China, commonly known as the open door policy. Though understandable in light of past policy from John Hay forward, Stimson's statement was, from a diplomatic perspective, deplorable. And I will confess that this was not my own view of Stimson and the Stimson non-recognition doctrine until recently. He's a man whose statesmanship I generally have very high regard for. The historian Waldo Heinrichs, in a fine biography of the American ambassador to Japan, Drew, made this comment about the Stimson doctrine. Stimson was using precedent to create what amounted to new law. He imparted more acceptance to Hay's open door notes than existed. It included Manchuria in China proper, whereas the Nine-Power Treaty had not been so precise. He gave positive force to the Kellogg Pact, which his signatories had hardly intended. He directed American policy explicitly and unequivocally against Japanese action. Perhaps most dangerously, he established a wrong without a remedy. What henceforth, this is my words, what henceforth forward could American diplomats do? They were straitjacketed by the Stimson doctrine. Even Herbert Hoover's successor as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, faced with the more immediate challenge of dealing with the Great Depression and massive unemployment, went along with the strictures of the Stimson Declaration. That cobweb-looking figure, as you probably know, many of you, is from Charles Kindleberger's book on the Depression, showing the spiraling down of international trade in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Something which conceivably could happen again. If, for example, there's a failure of the WTO, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, APEC, and so on, and we have political leaders elected who become protectionist with the consequences that might flow from that. I didn't include it in the lecture. I wouldn't have said it, but let me say it now. There is a kind of analogy that could conceivably be at least thought of between this period with a Quaker president, Herbert Clark Hoover, who was a pacifist essentially, and a very hardline, militarily oriented Secretary of State who wanted action, Henry Stimson. It's a bit like that now with President Obama, who is very reluctant to use force, get involved in a further war, and his Secretary of State, John Kerry, with war experience himself, who would like to punctuate the diplomacy he's conducting with regard to Syria with military action, to reinforce his words. And is frustrated, obviously, that this is not happening. I don't want to overdo that analogy, but it made me think about the present situation, as history often does. It is a policy science, as Henry Kissinger said. Now, what happened in the 1920s, therefore, is that U.S. policy regarding Japan's moves, not just in Manchuria, but in China along the coast, was restricted by the Simpson Doctrine and the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the Nine-Power Treaty. There was a conference that was held in Brussels invoking the Nine-Power Treaty, but nothing much came out of that. So the actual burden of trying to maintain peace with Japan in the Asia-Pacific area fell to American ambassadors. And the key ambassador, I'll briefly mention his name before, was Joseph Clark Root, who is the subject of Walter Heinrich's great biography. He was ambassador for about a decade, a very experienced diplomat. He was in favor of what he termed constructive conciliation with Japan. He was opposed in the State Department itself by Stanley K. Hornbeck, who was the advisor for Far Eastern Affairs, who was a China expert, and was strongly anti-Japanese along the lines of Henry Stimson's approach. Gru's suggestions regarding adjustment and compromise verged on, from Hornbeck's perspective, appeasement. Gru did his best, however, to maintain workable relations with the Japanese, even when Prince Konoye was replaced as prime minister by General Hideki Tojo. You can see in the photograph, Gru with the new foreign minister of Japan, Admiral Tejiro Toyoda, who was a personal friend. So an effort was made to at least maintain relations during that period. Gru's personal view, according to his private secretary, was that the die had been cast when Prince Konoye gave up on the idea of a mid-Pacific personal meeting with Franklin Roosevelt. This is one of the great speculative counterfactuals in American-Japanese diplomatic history. What if they had met? FDR took the idea pretty seriously. He was actually thinking about the best place to meet, and he thought that Alaska, because it's on a great circle route, would be the most convenient place to meet rather than Hawaii. But he told the Japanese ambassador, Admiral Nomura, who had been a Japanese naval attaché in Washington when FDR himself was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, that it was important to settle a number of, quote, fundamental and essential questions beforehand if the success of a conference is to be safeguarded. He also said it would, quote, be necessary for us to discuss the matter fully with the British, which would have included the Australians, I suppose, at that time, but not necessarily the Australians, the Chinese, and also the Dutch, who had interests, of course, in this region. Richard Casey was appointed to be the semi-autonomous representative of Australia in Washington at this time, in part because of these events. And he represented Australia very, very effectively, bringing an Australian voice to the discussion. The talks that were conducted not by FDR, who decided not to try to meet with the Japanese Prime Minister, Konoye, by the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who was an old Wilsonian, free trader, a strict moralist, adhered to the rules, he had very little international experience, and he met secretly with the Japanese in his hotel apartment in a series of talks which included, oddly, a Marino missionary priest named Father James Drought in the photograph in the upper corner, the young man. The Marino missionaries had interests in Japan and elsewhere in Asia, and obviously wanted to protect their position and to avoid war. Drout produced a document, a kind of terms of agreement, settlement between the United States and Japan, which the United States State Department thought maybe reflected Japanese unofficial views. The Japanese very probably assumed that because Drout was American, these reflected sort of unstated American official views. What happened was that when Secretary Hull finally stated the basic American position, that Japan's role, its military status in China was against international law, the Nine-Part Treaty and so on, and it had to withdraw from China as well as Indochina, it probably appeared not unreasonably to the Japanese that the United States was hardening its position. This is a beautiful example of the importance of keeping amateurs, out of service negotiating at this time. Even track 2 diplomacy, I cautioned my colleagues who are very interested in that in the diplomatic academy world. It wasn't only these Marino fathers who got involved. It was the Treasury Department on the other side of the White House. The Secretary of the Treasury at that time was Henry Morgenthau, Jr., close friend of FDR. And he had a very brilliant assistant in the lower corner, Harry Dexter White, controversial figure. Some said he was a spy for the Soviet Union, others denied that. What he proposed in the memorandum that he drafted, which Morgenthau gave to Hull, was that the United States offered to buy from Japan some of its warships, and would allow Japan to purchase fuel, oil and gas, scrap metal, other war materials from the United States. Even Stanley Hornbeck would have been appalled by this idea. Apparently was sufficiently interested in it to suggest that China be given the same offer, because the Treasury Department had been helping China by supporting its currency, by buying tung oil and so on. It had a commodity-based currency. This was too little too late, and it was too imaginative. But what it suggests to me is that by this time, when the United States economy was improving, partly because of the rearmament, the United States had great economic capacity, which simply was not being used in the 1930s, as it could and should have been. I'd like to now turn more briefly, because it's more familiar, I assume, it certainly is to me, to the American supremacy era. Yep. Sure, okay, right, thank you. This was the period, and here's where I can use the PowerPoints to the slides to actually expedite the discussion. Douglas MacArthur was the supreme Allied commander, and he personally established a phase of making the Pacific Ocean almost an American lake by accepting the Japanese imperial forces surrender, and by having the Japanese Emperor Hirohito appear personally before him to accept his own suzerainty over Japan. In the Pacific itself, a lot of islands were taken over, and part of the order that was established, the international order at that time, was the United Nations order, the charter which allowed the United States to have a strategic trusteeship over many of the islands in the Pacific, arguably as a basis for the United Nations itself becoming strong enough to assume control. Dean Acheson, who was Truman's Secretary of State, in a speech in 1950, articulated a defensive perimeter to include Japan, Philippines, but not to include, though he didn't leave them out explicitly, Korea and Formosa. It has been thought in retrospect that this was a kind of green light to the North Koreans and Stalin to invade, because the United States was writing off the Korean Peninsula. What Acheson actually said was, the United Nations had not yet proved to be a weak reed on which to lean. In other words, that collective security would be available to protect Korea. Again, the assumption was that the United States was supreme in that region, and through the UN, even Korea, though not a vital interest as Japan was to the United States, could be protected. This was, to some degree, an expression of George Kennan's concept of containment. And in 1954, when the French withdrew from Indochina, John Foster Dulles, who refused to shake hands with Zhou Enlai in Geneva, took the lead with Britain in forming the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was part of a kind of hub and spoke system, which I alluded to earlier, in the Pacific. It was sometimes said that ANZUS of 1951 was a sort of a smaller version of NATO, but in fact, as you know very well, the commitment was not reciprocal. That Australia and New Zealand were not committed to defend the United States as clearly as the NATO allies were committed to defend each other. There were similar treaties with the Philippines, which became independent, with South Korea, and eventually with Japan as well. SEATO, in 1954, was initiated really more by the British than by the Americans. And I've been reading Alan Renou's book called The Frightened Country, excellent book on SEATO. And he makes the point that each of the participants in SEATO had very different objectives. And particularly the economic aspects of it were really just window dressing from his point of view. But SEATO didn't last except in the commitment that the United States still has with Thailand, which was not covered in any other agreement. The United States was supporting the Zim government in the 1950s under the Eisenhower period. In 1959, the North Korean regime, my wife Pam and I are going to be visiting, the Vietnamese regime are going to be visiting Vietnam shortly, moved south, and John F. Kennedy was initially concerned about Laos, and this led, of course, to a deep, long war in which the United States and Australia were deeply and very painfully involved. SEATO was invoked. You see a meeting of Lyndon Johnson with some of the SEATO leaders in the smaller picture at the bottom. The end of the period of American supremacy, as I've called it, came with Nixon and Kissinger, who, in brief, shifted from an American security policy premised on 2.5 wars to 1.5 wars. That is, the United States would plan for future conflict against only one major adversary, and then one smaller one, a regional conflict in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia. This clearly was, among other things, a signal to the Chinese that the Soviet Union was considered to be the major challenger to the United States. And that allowed, with some fancy diplomacy through Pakistan and Romania, the Nixon trip to China in 1972. And it also allowed for the negotiation of a settlement of a kind, at least the American withdrawal of forces from Vietnam, with both China and Russia pulling back from support for Hanoi during that period. This achieved peace with honor. Now finally, and I'll be very brief about this, the partnerships phase. In the partnerships era, which is different from the treaty-based, the alliance-based era, there are many different connections, networks of various kinds. Efforts are made to get the parties in the region themselves to achieve consensus on issues of concern to them. Not only governments, but also corporations and populations became involved. People power became a factor. And this is, to some degree, I wouldn't call it an achievement, but it's partly a consequence of American foreign policy supporting democracy. In the Philippines, for which the United States has some historical responsibility, going back to the Spanish-American War, to allow the Philippine people to achieve self-determination. The Marcos regime did not allow that. Stephen Bosworth, the American ambassador, who later became dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, he passed away recently, was the ambassador that brought about a power transition in the Philippines that was remarkably peaceful. And this is an indication of a new factor in the equilibrium of the Pacific region. Another major new issue, which has a lot of contemporary significance, is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That's Elliot Richardson, who was the American negotiator, Republican. He worked both for Republicans and Democrats. Tommy Koh was his close ally, the Singaporean president of the third meeting of the convention. The U.S. has not ratified, shamefully has not ratified UNCLOS, but it does adhere to and support most of the principles. APEC is another part of the order, which is traceable historically to the open door policy of an earlier time. It was actually Australia. It was Rob Hawke and Gareth Evans who initiated that. But the first leaders meeting was held in Seattle during the presidency of Bill Clinton. I think that's Prime Minister Keating behind it, if I'm not mistaken. APEC still provides a framework, a larger frame for the TPP discussion. It hasn't gone away. And it includes, of course, you saw the picture of Jiang Zemin. It includes the People's Republic of China. Another major aspect of the partnerships era has to do with the environmental dimension. At the conference in Canberra, there was a good deal of discussion about Pacific Island diplomacy, the new Pacific diplomacy, with global warming being a huge factor for Kiribati in a lot of other countries. At the same time, bilateral relations with China are being conducted, and in a very structured way through the strategic and economic dialogue, of which you see a photograph at the bottom. So it's a deep, integrated, organized relationship that these two countries are maintaining between themselves, despite conflicts and personality difficulties. President Obama has been meeting with ASEAN leaders. He was in Laos just recently, in which he encouraged them, among other things, to achieve consensus with regard to the South China Sea. That didn't happen, but there were expressions of concern. And of course, he himself is a Pacific person. When he came to Australia in 2011 and spoke before your parliament, he made the statement which is quoted and re-quoted by Vice President Biden and others. The United States is a Pacific power, and we are here to stay. So I would say the U.S. is an established Pacific power. Not necessarily rising or declining, but it is part of the permanent structure of relations in this region. And one of the major structural elements in it is the Pacific Command. The Navy, Admiral Harry Harris, who's in Hawaii, has a major role in the diplomacy of this region. As he said, he has something like 400,000 personnel, under his command. We watch over half the Earth. You can see that the sphere of operational responsibility for PACOM includes most of the Indian Ocean and most of the Pacific, all the way up to South America and North America. From Hollywood to Bollywood, penguins to polar bears. And there's a lot of new technology that is being developed as well. And very recently, Ashton Carter, the new Secretary of Defense, has been in Asia, meeting with leaders and emphasizing the importance of partnership in its various forms, and of course upholding the principle of the maritime commons that the United States and other countries, in order to accommodate the rise of all countries in the region, need to and should respect the rules of the road at sea, in the air, in cyberspace as well. The TPP, maybe that would be a topic we could possibly touch upon in conversation. I don't know how it's going to go, but what I did emphasize and would again stress is within the context of APEC and the WTO. It is not economic containment of China. It's to try to set standards which will have an influence on the norms, the principles, and the rules of international trade for a long time to come. Finally, the G20 Hangzhou Summit, which was certainly symbolic of China's rise and its having risen. One doesn't forget, I think, you see it in a smaller photograph, that the G20 met first in Washington, D.C. under the presidency of George W. Bush for the purposes of dealing with the financial crisis. So the whole emphasis on economic stability is something which is a product of American diplomacy. Obama had difficulties, had challenges when he met with Putin, for example, and Duterte in China. But nonetheless, it is a very clear manifestation of the prominence of not just American leadership and diplomacy in the region, but American concepts historically developed as well. I think that would be a good point for